Highbridge, a division of recorded books, presents Toscanini, Musician of Conscience, by Harvey Sachs. Read by Paul Boehmer. Preface. If I thought that my life could interest anyone, I would have a lot to tell. Arturo Toscanini remarked to some friends during a late-in-life conversation. The friends laughed in disbelief. At the time, tens of millions of people worldwide knew Toscanini's name, and many among them would certainly have been interested to hear or read his own account of his life. But writing a memoir would have been out of character for him. He never made the attempt. There was a lot to tell. Toscanini was one of the most scrupulous and dynamic opera and concert conductors of all time, and the first-born among them to have made abundant use of the electronic media, and to have left recordings of substantial portions of his repertoire. His work, as an interpreter, was so original and so powerful that it has influenced musicians down to our own day. Generations of conductors, including those who disagreed or disagree with his interpretations, have been the beneficiaries of his reforms in the opera house and concert hall, and his insistence that the performer's job is to come as close as possible to revealing the composer's intentions, rather than to use the music as a vehicle for self-expression, remains a basic principle for many of today's outstanding performers. The intransigent personality that allowed him to accomplish his reforms and pursue his musical ideals also led him to stand up to Europe's fascist regimes in the 1930s. As a result, he became an example of nonpartisan political morality. In the mid-1970s, when I was working on my first Toscanini biography, published in the United Kingdom and the United States in 1978, and subsequently in many other editions and translations, I was able to gather first-hand testimony from many of my subject's family members, colleagues, and friends. But primary source material from Toscanini himself was scarce, since he had rarely granted interviews or written about himself for publication. Then, in the mid-1990s, approximately 1,500 of his letters came to light, a discovery that culminated in the publication, in 2002, of The Letters of Arturo Toscanini, which I edited, translated, and annotated. In his letters, Toscanini revealed his thoughts about himself, his family, other people, the music he studied and performed, his work, travels, early life, tastes in literature and the visual arts, political beliefs and activities, and attitudes toward love and sex. Later, two of his grandchildren, Valfredo Toscanini and Emanuela Castelbarco, made available to me more than 100 tape recordings of their grandfather in conversation with his family, friends, and colleagues during the last years of his life. These conversations, recorded without Toscanini's knowledge, shed even more light on his life and thoughts. Much other significant material has emerged during the 40 years since I was writing the early biography. The archives of many of the organizations with which Toscanini worked, La Scala's, for instance, have opened up, as have previously unexamined parts of the Metropolitan Operas and the New York Philharmonic's archives, and the Italian fascist government's enormous dossier on Toscanini, who was considered one of the most prominent enemies of Mussolini's regime. Most important, the Toscanini family's vast official archive, the Toscanini Legacy, was acquired by the New York Public Library in 1986 and catalogued during the 1990s, and I supplemented my investigation of the material contained therein with the abundant documentation that belonged to the grandchildren. Most of Valfredo Toscanini's material has since been united with the Toscanini Legacy Collection, and Emanuela Castelbarco's has been acquired by the Archivio di Stato in Milan. I was also able to travel to Buenos Aires to investigate documentation of the 5 substantial opera seasons that Toscanini conducted there between 1901 and 1912, and I have made use of many other sources as well. In short, this book is a completely new biography, not a revision or an expanded version of the earlier book. Apart from quotations from other sources, I don't believe that a single entire sentence from the old book is to be found in this one. I have examined new sources, re-examined old ones, and produced what I hope is a close to definitive account of a long life filled with artistic, personal, and political drama. I have tried to probe my subject's complicated character and to describe his relationships, some of them deep, others casual, with the remarkable figures he knew firsthand, including composers. Verdi, Boito, Puccini, Mahler, Debussy, Richard Strauss, Ravel, Stravinsky, Kodály. Conductors, Mengelberg, Walter, Beecham, Stokowski, Ansermet, Furtwängler, Erich Kleiber, Fritz Busch, De Sabata, Zell, and Cantelli. Instrumentalists, Busoni, Hubermann, Adolf Busch, Arthur Rubinstein, Heifetz, Horowitz, Piatigorsky, Menuhin. Writers, Gabriele D'Annunzio, Stefan Zweig, Thomas Mann. Mussolini, Einstein, the historian, Gaetano Salvemini, the philosopher, Benedetto Croce. The descendants of Richard Wagner, and most of the well-known singers active from the 1870s through the 1950s and beyond, from Paul Léry, Bizet's first Don José, and Victor Maurel, Verdi's first Iago and Falstaff, through Enrico Caruso and Theodore Chaliapin, and on to Renata Tebaldi and Giuseppe Di Stefano. Toscanini's was a 90-year life that began before the invention of the phonograph and the incandescent light bulb, and ended at the dawn of the space age. An 80-year musical immersion that began before Wagner and Verdi had written their final masterpieces, and that ended in the era of Boulez and Stockhausen. A 68-year career carried out in 20 European, North and South American, and Middle Eastern countries, and a private existence that was torn between love of family and erotic recklessness. There is, as Toscanini said, a lot to tell, and I have tried to tell it honestly, thoroughly, and engagingly. Author's Notes. 1. In order to avoid long lists of performances and repertoire within the body of the text, I am providing the following lists online at https://www.scribd.com/document/342450854. The first is a chronological list of all of Toscanini's known performances. The second, an alphabetical list, by composer, of all the works in his repertoire, with the dates of their performances. These two lists can easily be cross-referenced. A third list provides a select bibliography, and a fourth provides reference notes for all quotations, and much other material as well. These two have been created in order to avoid encumbering the physical book. 2. The following information is provided to enable listeners to convert fees, salaries, ticket prices, and the like into present-day values. Historic exchange rates, approximate, in Toscanini's lifetime. US dollars to Italian lira to British pounds. Up to 1915, 1 US dollar equals 5.5 Italian lira, equals 0.20 British pounds. 1920 to 1926, 1 US dollar equals 25 Italian lira, equals 0.20 British pounds. 1927 to 1939, 1 US dollar equals 19 Italian lira, equals 0.20 British pounds. Second World War and immediate post-war years, anomalous. 1950 to 1957, 1 US dollar equals 625 Italian lira, equals 0.38 British pounds. In average purchasing power, 1 US dollar in 1885 to 1908 equals 25 US dollars in 2016. 1 US dollar in 1926 equals 13.40 US dollars in 2016. 1 US dollar in 1932 equals 17.30 US dollars in 2016. 1 US dollar in 1937 equals 16.50 US dollars in 2016. 1 US dollar in 1945 equals 13.20 US dollars in 2016. 1 US dollar in 1954 equals 8.81 US dollars in 2016. Chapter 1. Indeterminate and Determinate Sounds. Milan, 11 May, 1946. The war has been over for a year, but the devastation and grief that it provoked have barely begun to fade. The city is still filled with rubble, chunks of the historic Duomo and of the Galleria, the glass-roofed 19th-century arcade that connects the vast Piazza del Duomo to the smaller Piazza della Scala, are still missing. There is much poverty, and even more near poverty. People have to scrounge for basic necessities. Most homes lacked heat through the previous winter, and electric power still fails frequently. But something unusual is in the air this evening. By 8 o'clock, people are streaming into the Galleria and the Piazza del Duomo, where loudspeakers have been hung from buildings and lampposts. The Piazza della Scala, similarly festooned, is already crowded with onlookers, and the doors of the old Teatro alla Scala itself are about to open to receive an audience for the first time in nearly 3 years. During several summer nights in 1943, bombs from Allied planes demolished large swaths of the city as part of a massive and ultimately successful attempt to force Italy's fascist government to surrender. And on the night of the 15th to 16th of August, a firebomb crashed through the roof of La Scala, leaving the stage and backstage areas intact, but reducing much of the auditorium to ruins. Since war's end, the reconstruction of La Scala has been a high priority of the Allied military government. More than any other building in the nation's commercial capital, La Scala is a symbol of secular Italian civilization, and funding its restoration is seen as a major gesture of goodwill toward a country that is still reeling from the disastrous effects of fascism and of Mussolini's ill-conceived and ill-fated alliance with Hitler. The house is now ready, and its old master, who had not set foot in it for 16 years, and who had been living in exile for the last 8 of those years, has returned to prepare and conduct the inaugural concert. An hour or so earlier, a crowd of Arturo Toscanini's admirers was hovering around the artist's entrance in Via Filodramatici, hoping to catch a glimpse of the 79-year-old conductor, who is not only the most celebrated performing musician in the world, but also a symbol of unwavering resistance to totalitarianism. Now, the maestro and his family are inside the theater. He has made sure that the evening soloists have arrived and are warming up, and he is trying to collect his thoughts as he paces, nervously, back and forth in his dressing room. 60 years have passed since he first entered La Scala, 50 since he first conducted here. This is where he observed Verdi rehearsing the first production of Otello, where he conducted the world premiere of Puccini's Turandot, and the national premieres of Siegfried, Eugene Onegin, Salome, Péléas et Mélisande, and many other works where he coached and assisted and tormented 3 generations of singers, orchestra musicians, chorus members, and production staffs, and where he presided over groundbreaking organizational and technical reforms. For many years he dedicated himself to this institution, and even from afar he has never ceased to concern himself with its fortunes. Now he has come back as an old man to face his public, in his theater, in his adoptive city, in his beloved country. At a few minutes to 9 he picks up his baton and walks from the dressing room to the wings. Through an opening, he sees the house lights go down, and he hears the audience become quiet. He fears that he may faint. At exactly 9 o'clock, the stage manager says, "Maestro, we're ready. Break a leg," and opens the door for him. Toscanini walks decisively onto the stage. Section 1. Parma is one of the most beautiful cities in northern Italy, and thanks to the global mania for Parma ham, Parmesan cheese, and other local culinary products, it is also among the most prosperous and well-looked-after ones. Banks and industries provide the wherewithal for restoring the old center's monuments. Pedestrian-only zones have been thoughtfully laid out, and signs pointing the way to sites of historic, cultural, or purely practical interest. If Toscanini, who was born in Parma in the 3rd quarter of the 19th century, and spent most of his childhood and adolescence there, could revisit his hometown today, he would have no trouble finding his way around its center or recognizing most of the buildings in the area. But he would be astonished not only by the city's vastly expanded outskirts, but also by the historic center's well-turned-out appearance. Photographs of Parma from the time of Toscanini's youth show shabbily dressed urchins in front of buildings with smoke-darkened, peeling facades. You can almost smell the poverty. In the 18th century, Toscanini's paternal ancestors lived about 50 miles from Parma, in the remote mountain village of Bogli, in the township of Ottone, in the upper Trebbia valley of the Ligurian Apennine. Bogli di Ottone now lies in a corner of the Regione, roughly equivalent to a U.S. state, of Emilia-Romagna, that converges with the Regione of Lombardy, Piedmont, and Liguria. The name Toscanini means Little Tuscans. The family had evidently emigrated from what is today the Regione of Tuscany, the northwesternmost reaches of which lie only about 25 miles from Bogli. Of Simone and Maria Toscanini, the conductor's great-great-grandparents and earliest known ancestors, we have only the names. But their son Pietro, born in Bogli in 1769, is known to have migrated to the town of Cortemaggiore, 50 miles away in the Po Valley, where he married one Domenica Alberici. Pietro and Domenica's son, Angelo, Arturo's paternal grandfather, 1790 to 1864, eventually became the owner of a textile mill in Corte Maggiore, and of a small shop there and another in Piacenza, the provincial capital, where he sold his products. Angelo had no known musical talent, but as a begetter of children, his achievements rivaled those of the prolific Johann Sebastian Bach. His first wife, Giuseppe Zerbini, 1795 to 1821, produced 8 children, including 2 sets of twins, in 8 years. 12 days after the birth of her second set of twins, she committed suicide by throwing herself down a well. 4 months later, Angelo married Eligia Bombardi, Arturo's grandmother, who was born in Corte Maggiore in 1795 and was evidently made of stronger stuff than her predecessor. She gave birth 12 times and survived. But the infant mortality rate was so high that by the time Eligia's last child was born, the Corte Maggiore census registry listed only 10 of Angelo Toscanini's 18 offspring. Claudio Toscanini, Arturo's father, was born on the 25th of January, 1833, the third youngest of Angelo and Eligia's children. At the age of 12, he had an argument with his father, slapped Angelo's face with a handkerchief, left home, and walked 30 miles to Parma, where he was given lodging by a sister, and began to work as a tailor. He was of a restless nature, and his restlessness dovetailed fortuitously with major political events that were unfolding when he was in his teens and 20s. Italy, splintered into city-states, duchies, and foreign-run territories since the fall of the Roman Empire a millennium and a half earlier, was on the verge of becoming a nation. By the 1850s, the Risorgimento movement, which had begun among middle and upper-class radicals as an expression of discontent with foreign rule, had spread to vast numbers of Italians of all classes. In 1858, Count Cavour, Prime Minister of King Victor Emmanuel II of Piedmont, Savoy, and Sardinia, plotted with France to provoke a war with Austria and create a kingdom of northern Italy that would annex the Austrian-dominated Lombardy, Veneto, and central Italian duchies to the king's other territories. Claudio Toscanini was among the many young volunteers who joined General Giuseppe Garibaldi's red-shirted, irregular army to help the Piedmontese fight the Austrians, despite Garibaldi's aversion to monarchy. But after the combined Italian and French forces had won the battles of Magenta and Solferino, and had triumphantly taken control of Milan, Napoleon III pulled France out of the agreement. An armistice with Austria was signed. Piedmont and Lombardy remained weakly confederated, and Garibaldi's forces were disbanded. In 1860, however, the charismatic general reassembled his red shirts. Claudio enlisted and took part in the successful campaign to rid Sicily of Bourbon rule, then joined the Bersaglieri, sharpshooters, a division of the regular armed forces. The following year, a plebiscite created the Kingdom of Italy under Victor Emmanuel, with its capital in Turin. But Garibaldi, angry with the new national government for its unwillingness to wrest Rome from the control of Pope Pius IX, again began to gather a volunteer corps. Claudio, as hot-headed as ever, deserted the Bersaglieri to join his idol's irregular forces in Sicily in a campaign that was intended to sweep northward toward the ancient imperial capital. The attempt ended on the 29th of August, 1862, when Garibaldi's 1,500 red shirts were confronted by the regular army, 3,500 strong, at Aspromonte, in Calabria. There was a brief skirmish. Garibaldi was wounded, and the regular army took control. Claudio and his fellow deserters were imprisoned and sentenced to death. Some were shot, but Claudio was among those resentenced to life in prison, where he contracted scurvy and lost some of his teeth, but survived for 3 years, until a royal decree pardoned the surviving Aspromonte irregulars. A young man, Giuseppe Montani, was among the volunteers from Parma who had taken part with Claudio Toscanini in Garibaldi's Sicilian expedition of 1860. And after Claudio's return from prison, Giuseppe introduced him to his family. Before long, Paolina, called Paola, one of Giuseppe's sisters, had become engaged to Claudio. The Montani family hailed from Altare, a hill town west of Genoa, known for its master glassworkers. In 1827, the 20-year-old Pietro Montani, Paola's father and the future conductor's maternal grandfather, made his way to Parma, where he was employed first by the Serventi, and then by the better-known Bormioli glassworks. Pietro married Carolina Notari, born 1811, in nearby Reggio Emilia. Paola was the fourth of Pietro and Carolina's 10 children. Pietro was the son of Giuseppe Antonio and Anna Maria, née Grani or Greni, Montani. Arturo Toscanini later described Grandpa Pietro as a handsome man who had such a beautiful beard that local artists used him as a model for Joseph in paintings of the Holy Family. Parma's Bormioli glassworks still exists in the 21st century. Paola's family warned her about becoming attached to Claudio Toscanini, a womanizer and anything but a steady worker. She, however, was already in her mid-20s. Paola was born on the 29th of June, 1840, a spinster, by the standards of the day, and Claudio, 7 years her senior, was an attractive fellow. They were married in Parma's Santo Spirito Church on the 7th of June, 1866. A few days later, Claudio learned that Garibaldi was once again gathering his Corpo Volontari Italiani to help in the imminent Third War of Independence. He said goodbye to his bride, and off he went, together with 2 of his brothers-in-law. One night, toward the end of June, Claudio's troop train stopped in Parma, and the new husband slipped away to spend a few hours with his wife. "That night they manufactured me," their son said with a chuckle many years later. These and many other direct Toscanini quotations, most of them translated from Italian, are taken from tapes of conversations recorded unbeknownst to the maestro in the 1950s. In mid-July, Claudio fought in the successful battles of Castelcondino and Bezzecca near Lake Garda. Austria won the brief war, but ceded Venice to France as a token of gratitude for Napoleon III's intermediary efforts. France allowed Venice to become part of the Kingdom of Italy, but the Trentino would remain Austrian for another half-century. Claudio returned home, put away his red shirt, and went back to tailoring, albeit unenthusiastically. On the 7th of November, 1866, a confidential political report from the Royal Prefecture of Parma, sent to the Ministry of the Interior in Florence, noted that 5 or 6 citizens belonging to the Radical Party met to discuss badly needed assistance for the periodical L'Unità Italiana. A new assessment was made, and one Toscanini Claudio, son of Angelo, 30 years old, tailor, and Ceresini Augusto, both resident in Parma and both already compromised in the Aspromonte affair, were charged with collecting donations to that end. Their footsteps will be followed. The Radical Party in question was the Associazione Unitaria Democratica, an anti-monarchist group headed by the exiled Giuseppe Mazzini. Claudio was also a leader of the local branch of the similarly anti-monarchist Alleanza Repubblicana Universale, and a member of its fearful-sounding but in fact dormant. Compagnie di...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?